Hi, it's Kristen May. We are at the Shellring Trail, one of the many trails in the Francis Marion National Forest, and I really like this trail because you can compare and contrast different ecosystems. Today we are going to focus on what we can find at the salt marsh of the Shellring Trail. But before we get to the salt marsh, we actually have to walk through a maritime forest. So I want you guys to be comparing and contrasting the different flora or the different plants that we see in the forest versus the plants that we see on the edge of the salt marsh versus the plants that we actually can find in the salt marsh itself. Let's get started. All right, before we go any further, I want to point out something. Everyone take a look behind us. Look at the trees. When you're looking through the trees, what do you notice? All I see is more and more trees, all right? Now let's look in front of us. Look through the trees. Do you see how the canopy is clearing and you can see the sky and empty spaces? What do you think that's a sign of? That's a sign that we're getting close to water and we're getting close to the salt marsh where big trees can't grow, so it doesn't have that canopy. So we're really close to the salt marsh. So how many different types of plants do you guys see out there? I only see one, and it is cordgrass. Now, when we were walking through the forest, did you see just one type of plant? Absolutely not. There were tons of different shrubs and vines and trees and even flowers. So why do you think that is? Why is there more plant biodiversity in the forest than there is out in the salt marsh? Think about it. You are at home right now. Would your parents like it if you started watering all of your houseplants with salt water? Absolutely not. That would probably kill them. Most plants cannot tolerate living in salt water or even close to salt water. So when we were walking through the forest, those plants get fresh water from the rain, but out in the salt marsh, the plants in the salt marsh have to live in salt water. So we saw plants while we walked through the forest. We looked at the singular plant, the cordgrass in the salt marsh. Now I want you to look at and observe the plants on the perimeter of the salt marsh. What do you notice? Yes, there are trees and there are different types of trees, but there's not a lot of biodiversity of those trees. I'm just saying a few. One of the ones that I see a lot of around the perimeter of the salt marsh are these beautiful trees right here, live oak trees. The reason why these oaks are called live oak trees is because this is a deciduous tree that actually does not lose its leaves in the wintertime. Its leaves all year round are usually this green color, so it always looks alive, hence the name live oak. Why do live oaks live on the perimeter of the salt marsh? Well, live oaks are saltwater tolerant. Let's look a little bit closer at this live oak. Do you see anything else growing on the live oak? Live oaks are a staple of places like Charleston, South Carolina, and a lot of times we think of this gray stuff that hangs off these trees. This is called Spanish moss. Now, Spanish moss is not from Spain and it's not even moss. So why the heck do we call it Spanish moss? Well, it kind of looks like moss, and also it was named because it kind of looks like long pointy beards, and a long pointy beard was a common fashion statement of the Spanish colonists. Let's take an even closer look. Do you guys see this gray stuff growing on the live oak? That is a type of lichen. And another plant that I see growing on this live oak are these ferns right here. Resurrection ferns are their common name. Why are they called resurrection ferns? Well, when there hasn't been enough water, these ferns turn brown and they shrivel up. And then the next time it rains, it's almost like they're reborn and they come alive again and they turn that bright green, beautiful color. Those plants can only lose about 10% of their water before a lack of water will cause them to die. Resurrection ferns can lose between 75 and even up to 97% of the water that they need and still be able to come back and be reborn and resurrected when another rainfall comes. So we just talked about 3 different species that use the live oak as its home. So a live oak is almost like an individual ecosystem itself. Other things grow on it, make its home on it as well. Now, one important thing I want to talk about with the resurrection fern and the Spanish moss and the lichen, these are not parasitic. Especially Spanish moss, a lot of people think that it's a sign of a dead or an unhealthy tree. That is not true. Spanish moss does not take anything from the tree itself. It just needs somewhere to grow. Spanish moss gets water and other particles out of the air. It doesn't take anything from the tree. Another plant that's really common around the area of the salt marsh because it is saltwater tolerant is the Yaupon holly. The way that you can tell it's a Yaupon holly is looking at its leaves, and also a lot of times Yaupon holly bushes will have red berries and these cute little white flowers. Some cool facts about Yaupon hollies is their berries are actually poisonous. If you ingest them, it'll upset your stomach. And also, one really cool thing about Yaupon holly, if you were to brew their leaves, it would make a caffeinated beverage, like a sweet tea is caffeinated. Yaupon hollies are actually the only native plant in North America that is caffeinated. Another saltwater tolerant plant that we can find growing on the edge of the salt marsh is this guy right here, the red cedar. So how do I know it's a red cedar? Well, it's a coniferous tree. Instead of broad leaves, it has needles, but these don't look like pine needles. They're scaly and they branch off all over the place. Another distinctive characteristic of red cedars is its patchy, flaky bark. Do you see how this bark is pretty flaky and it flakes off? Red cedars, a lot of times people think they might have blueberries. Take a look at these, but these actually aren't berries. They're mini cones. Just like pine cones grow on pine trees, red cedars are also a coniferous tree that grow cones. They're just teeny, teeny, tiny. Now that we're getting actually into the salt marsh, plant biodiversity is really, really low. One of the main plants that grows on the edge or in the lower salt marsh is pickleweed. There's a lot of it growing right here. So this is what pickleweed looks like. Pickleweed has a special adaptation to allow it to survive in the saltier water. Pickleweed stores the water, kind of like a cactus, and it stores the salty water in chambers. And when those chambers get super, super salty, the pickleweed will turn red and that part of the pickleweed will fall off, thus getting rid of the salt that it does not need. Here is a pickleweed that has turned red and fallen off the plant, getting rid of that salt. These plants are edible and they actually do kind of taste like pickles. Now, the main plant that I think of when I think of the salt marsh is cordgrass. Look out into the salt marsh. That is the only plant that you see growing throughout the entire salt marsh. Now, cordgrass can take up the salt water and then spit out the salt onto the blades of grass. That's not just a special adaptation that they have to help them survive, it actually helps out some other species in the salt marsh, like periwinkle snails. This is a periwinkle snail. Periwinkle snails will travel up and down blades of cordgrass, feeding on the algae that grows on the blade's surface. Look at all of these periwinkle snails traveling up and down blades of cordgrass. Some snails will actually spend their entire lives just on one blade of cordgrass, traveling up and down and up and down. Cordgrass is essential to the entire salt marsh ecosystem. The cordgrass provides habitat and food for many of the species that live in the salt marsh, and also cordgrass through their roots stabilize the salt marsh and prevents erosion. Without cordgrass, there would be no salt marsh ecosystem. Thanks for coming out with me to explore the flora of the salt marsh at the Seaweed Shell Ring Trail in the Francis Marion. I'll see you next time.